Hi folks, so by now I'm sure you've all heard the news. Yup, mass layoff at Intercept Games, the developer of KSP2. It seems this came down from Take-Two Interactive, who owns Private Division, which contracted KSP2 development to Intercept Games. Kind of a weird little chain structure there. We don't know much for sure yet. There's a lot of confusion, and the only info we have from either Intercept or Take-Two has just been corpo-speak nonsense aimed at investors and not the gaming community. And anyone who knows is probably trapped behind 5 layers of NDAs. I want to share some random thoughts about why I think KSP2 has struggled and kind of tie it into the current situation, so kick back and enjoy my mad ramblings for a little while. Maybe put this up in the background as you have the game going, or just, enjoy this chill mission I'm flying. This is mostly going to be a rant. Now first, when KSP2 was announced, the early trailers looked great, and I'm sure we all remember the hype train. Then, after KSP2 hit early access, the reviews started to come out and we all got our hands on the first EA builds. Everyone was kind of left scratching their heads. Now I have some theories that I hesitated to share publicly at the time, but at this point it feels safe to just come out and say it. To me, the whole situation with early access absolutely reeked of a business unit revenue stream analysis from some C-suite executive or accountant. This is Tim with a business degree and 23 years out in Cube City and boardrooms talking, not Tim the gamer. What happens a lot of the time out in the general business world, not even related to game development, is that a company will break down each product line or revenue stream into a business unit. They don't just all lump it together. Now, the terminology can be different, and I'm kind of simplifying this a bit, but the basic concept is what matters here. Like a car company might have a business unit that makes sedans, another for pickup trucks, and another for buses. Sooner or later, during routine quarterly meetings and stuff, executives are going to get upset that the pickup truck business unit hasn't reported any revenue, but is eating millions of dollars of cost trying to get their new pickup truck ready. Well, Senior Vice President of whatever tells Junior Vice President of pickup trucks to show up with some revenue or risk getting shut down. That's what this whole situation smelled like to me. Someone higher up at Take-Two told Private Division to start posting revenue to justify the enormous expense of developing KSP2. I mean, it's got to be in the tens of millions so far, just given the head count and the facilities and everything and the timetable involved, right? Given that the game was still in, let's generously say, a late alpha build at the time, there really weren't many options on how to actually get any revenue out of it. The whole early access model is basically a way for the Steam platform to compete and offer some equivalences to crowdfunding revenue streams like Kickstarter and all that. Now, the idea being that players get early access to a game while it's still in development, and the developers get some cash to keep going, along with some kind of curated player feedback and all that. Kind of like paying to get into a closed beta, and it's actually a really good model when it's used correctly. A lot of amazing games have come out of the early access model, with Subnautica being a big standout that went through dramatic changes during early access, and the final release version turned into a smash hit. Now, you probably know all this, but it's important to point out one big detail. Early access is usually cheap. Generally, you're not paying full price to get in on early access. Again, Subnautica is a good example, as it was only $20 in early access, but the price went up to something more normal after it was released. When KSP2 came into early access, the cost was a full $50, not a discounted early access price, but a price closer to what we'd expect from a final release. Now, circling back to what I said a minute ago, this struck me at the time as a bad sign that Private Division might have been pressured to post some revenue. This is all guesswork, and a reminder, I don't have any inside information. Now, fast forward to actually getting my hands on the game. The bugs. Holy moly, the bugs. What we got at the start of early access struck me more as like a proof of concept alpha build, as opposed to something that had supposedly been in development for quite a while. The first early access builds, and I'm saying builds plural as I'm, including the first few patches, were well below the quality of other early access games I'd been into. That's when it hit me. Oh shit, they might be running low on money or getting pressure from the corpo daddy, Take-Two Interactive, to quickly generate some revenue to start offsetting the enormous financial investment in developing KSP2, and almost the only way to do that would be putting out whatever they had into early access. Now again, I want to be clear, I don't have any inside information, disclaimers. I'm just giving my opinion as to how things looked at the time based on publicly available information, which hasn't been much because the communications coming from everyone have been frustratingly inadequate. So that's the business side of what I think went wrong. Now, putting my gamer hat back on, what sucked about the actual game that prevented more people from being interested in getting in on early access? First, the bugs. Flying cities, Kraken attacks, magical Delta V numbers, vanishing craft, collision mesh issues, vanishing trajectory indicators, the list goes on, both in quantity and severity. A lot of the bugs, some of which are still in the game by the way, led to an enormous amount of angst from players who paid $50 to get in on early access to this, something that they at least expected was going to be like a late beta. Next, wobbly rockets. Now, part of the fun with KSP1 is that sometimes things don't work right and explode, but that was generally a byproduct of limits to the in-game engine combined with poorly designed rockets and spacecraft. It was fixable, often just by adding more struts, but generally speaking, if you had wobble and stability issues, they could be resolved through player activity, and you could avoid the issue entirely with a little bit of practice. In KSP2, rocket wobble was a deliberate design choice. We know this because the devs told us so after people complained, and there is code somewhere that added wobble to otherwise soundly designed rockets, as opposed to KSP1, where a primary side effect of poor design was the wobble and instability. In KSP2, it was forced on you, and for a lot of players, myself included, that was an absolutely enormous brick wall type of a problem. I, at the time, resorted to some light modding to remove rocket wobble completely, but I shouldn't have had to, and people still complain about it to this day. The wobble issue is about 90% resolved now in the current build, but it took quite a while, and this particular problem got a lot of attention early on. Next, the visuals. Now, KSP2 has absolutely beautiful visuals. Kind of. And the planets and moons look especially amazing. The problem is, all the rockets and spaceship parts. It looks far more cartoony than KSP1, which isn't easy to do since we're talking about a game with actual little green men in it. And all of the lighting effects on the parts look really oversaturated and overexposed. For a lot of players, myself included, this has been a bit of a turnoff since the start, and even if everything works out with KSP2 in the long run, I doubt this particular item is ever really going to change, unless there are like some really comprehensive mods that change lighting effects and everything. This brings us to a really serious annoyance that irks me personally pretty bad and has generated a fair amount of critical feedback. The general user interface in and for the vehicle assembly building. Now, the basic UI for vehicle construction is, in short, still a mess. There are a lot of UI conventions that feel completely counterintuitive, doubly so for people coming in from KSP1, and like various mouse clicks and arrow key inputs that instinctually feel like they should pan the camera or something end up recentering, rotating, or just having no effect, and similar attempts to pan and drag the camera either do nothing or give weird rotational views. KSP1's vehicle assembly UI and its camera control in the VAB are far from perfect, but what we have in KSP2 seems like a pretty significant downgrade. While we're in the vehicle assembly building, let's talk about saving. In KSP1, and just about every similar or comparable game that lets you build stuff, you save your work using the paradigm of your work being saved on its own. In KSP1, you also had the metaphor of subassemblies that you could save off for quick duplication or sharing a common component across different unrelated designs. In KSP2, all conventional wisdom has been blown out the airlock in favor of saving workspaces. Spaces that can contain one vehicle, many vehicles, a bunch of subassemblies, so on and so on. It honestly feels like more of a paradigm coming from industrial CAD software than a rocket game, and it's confusing as all hell to new players. It paradoxically amplifies the organizational problems it was meant to solve, and again, the whole workspaces thing feels completely counterintuitive. Lastly, we have the big one, the parts manager. Now, this is probably the biggest love it or hate it component of KSP2's overall user interface. And I know some people love it, and I'm sorry, but I'm firmly on the hate it team. Not the concept, but the way it's implemented and the fact that it's all or nothing. Now, in my opinion, having a parts manager that you could either use or ignore would have been much better. If the familiar UI convention of right-clicking on a part to see its options would still work, but if you had too many to manage, parts clipped in or buried into others or were just hard to get at, then you could add them to a parts manager type of panel as an opt-in, rather than a force-in as the only way to get your part options and functions like we ended up getting in Kerbal Space Program 2. In my opinion, these issues I just outlined were major contributing factors as to why KSP2 has kind of fizzled out in a slow burn over the last year of early access, and why, based on most estimates, sales of KSP2 haven't hit even a fraction of KSP1's active user base. Now, combine some of these fundamental issues with the extremely protracted development hell, the overall poor communication from Intercept, Private Division, and Take-Two, and it's not at all surprising if the monetary investment they've made so far into getting the IP and to developing KSP2 hasn't really proven to be financially sound. So, if this really is the beginning of the end for KSP2, I'm not happy, but I'm also not surprised. Now, how and why do I think all this happened? In short, bad leadership and bad organization. Again, this is just speculation, but it seems to me like far more attention had been placed, and I'm talking early on here, more attention had been placed on things that would look good in screenshots and teasers, and less attention placed on remedial level core gameplay elements. They wanted something that looked like a big AAA game in the marketing materials, and since nobody had their hands on it, it didn't really matter how it played yet. And then early access happened. Again, speculation, but I'd bet at least $5 that it was because Corpo Daddy wanted to see a revenue stream, and if Private Division had their way, it either wouldn't have gone to early access, or at least would have done so much later in the development cycle. Also, some of the issues I outlined a minute ago, like the parts manager and workspaces metaphor and stuff, feel like they're probably there because one person in a position of authority put their foot down and told the other developers, no, we're doing this even if you hate it, polish the turd and make it work. Now, especially given the pure quantity of complaints about some of this stuff that, I've seen on Discord and the forums and Reddit and everything, the fact that there weren't pretty big changes to those elements both underscores why I think this wasn't a good faith early access program to get feedback, and also why I think it was probably an authoritarian move rather than a more normal collaborative development. And if that's what it was, it would tell us a lot about why the game might be in development hell. With all that stirring in the back of your mind, I want to talk for a minute about what might have been. This hasn't been widely known until very recently, but Rocketwerkz, another game studio that has put out some seriously kick-ass titles, was one of the finalists pitching a proposal to develop KSP2. According to Dean Hall, the CEO of Rocketwerkz, they lost out because their pitch was aimed at the developers rather than the business execs, and it didn't have enough flashy visuals and concept art. Rocketwerkz is a company with, in my opinion, a really good track record of communicating with their games community, actually releasing quality titles, and keeping up a pretty good development tempo. If they had won the KSP2 bid, I suspect we might not be in this current mess. Now, the really interesting bit, Dean Hall let it slip out on Reddit that they've been quietly developing an unannounced space program game, and asked folks recently laid off from Intercept to reach out to him. So, who knows? Even if KSP2 implodes in on itself, maybe we get that spiritual successor after all, just without the little green men? Anyway, I've been rambling for a long time here. For now, I just wanted to let you know, this channel isn't dead, and I've just been holding off on more content until it was more obvious what was going to be happening with KSP2. Something tells me at this rate that I'm going to have more KSP1 content up here in the not-too-distant future. As always, thanks for watching.